What's up, my people? Ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters of all shapes, shades, and sizes. Welcome to Coblow'S Daily Therapy. I'm halfway finished through the book. Before I get started, I want to recommend another book on behavior, on man's behavior, mainly white man's behavior. The Iceman Inheritance. Prehistoric sources of Western man's racism, sexism, and aggression. That's another very important book for those that want to understand human behavior, where it comes from, its reason, logic, where they get their logic from and purpose. Those are the people in charge or whatever. What's going on, Tamika? And I'm about halfway finished through this post-traumatic slave syndrome. I still hope everybody go and get this book. I'm gonna read it again. This will be my second time reading. I'm gonna read it again after it's done. Because we all suffer from some kind of trauma and we need some kind of therapy. Some of us don't realize we're traumatized, but we still stuck in a cycle. I guess anytime you're really stuck in a cycle, you could be stuck under some kind of trauma. And we gotta make sure we don't just tell people to get over it. When they go through stuff, we just can't tell people to get over it. Because their way of getting over it, that's dysfunctional in itself. That makes you accept whatever the dysfunction or trauma is that you receive. It makes it normal. Desensitizes it to you. Makes you have to go and act and conform to being dysfunctional. And then make it seem like what you are doing is normal or right or average, when it really isn't. It's all just as dysfunctional as the dysfunction that you're receiving. So I'm going to go ahead and get started on this right here, Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome by Dr. Joy. I call it my Bible. I feel like it should be every black person's Bible. I'm on chapter 4. Chapter 4 has self-titled. It's the same title as the book, Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. And the passage that I'm starting on today is passing down the effects of trauma. So you can pretty much tell by that passage what that means. That means we've been traumatized, we adapted to it, and we passed it down. That same trauma or fear, that way of living that we adapted to because of trauma. So here we go, passing down the effects of trauma. Upon hearing the term post-traumatic slave syndrome, some of my readers might think to themselves, how could African Americans today possibly be affected by events that occurred so long ago? After all, African Americans are free now. In fact, they have been free for a long time. I've often heard European Americans irately say, you know what? I didn't own slaves, okay? And I'm tired of feeling guilty about what happened over 100 years ago, so get over it. Ain't that something? I just said something about get over it, huh? My response to them is that I am not a slave now, nor have I ever been a slave. And as far as I know, nobody I have known personally was a slave. The fact is, I don't have any experience of being a slave. However, hundreds of years of protracted slavery guaranteed the prosperity and privilege of the South's white progeny, while correspondingly relegating its black progeny to a legacy of debt and suffering. It doesn't really matter today if any of us, black or white, directly experienced or participated in slavery. What does matter is that African Americans have experienced a legacy of trauma. What is the legacy? How is it transmitted? As stated earlier, epigenetics research has revealed that the environment can influence our genes, and more specifically, that trauma can be transmitted over generations. The following excerpts describe how our bodies can store memories of past events. Behavior can be affected by events in previous generations which have been passed on through a form of genetic memory, animal studies suggest. A body of research shows that your DNA may contain a biological memory of the stress your grandparents endured. Can trauma, stress, and even nightmares be passed down from generation to generation? Scientists say yes. Epigenetics is how your environment influences your genes. Tara Swart, a senior lecturer at MIT, tells Fast Company. The two most famous studies are about Holocaust survivors, so people who became pregnant around that time, and then people who became pregnant just after, during, or after the famine, which was in the Netherlands around the same time. Those studies showed that people who were in starvation or stress just before they got pregnant, because they had either switched on or switched off certain stress genes, the baby was actually born with a different stress threshold than its mother's genes would have normally given it. This is the next passage. The epigenetics of PTSD. As previously explained, significant life-threatening experiences alter genetic coding, and this is heritable in subsequent generations. Therefore, it stands to reason that a child conceived post-trauma will acquire this adaptive genetic information. This legacy of trauma is reflected in many of our behaviors and our beliefs. These behaviors and beliefs may have been necessary for survival at one time, but today they undermine our ability to succeed. Remember the stories I told in the introduction? These are examples of behaviors that have been passed down through generations. Beliefs are harder to see, but they're nonetheless. I have a friend who has been working with teens for the past 14 years in both the African American community and in the affluent white suburbs. One day we were discussing the differences in his experiences, and he told me, "Joy, there's one major difference between the two groups that I have noticed. Both are very capable. Both groups are made up of basically good kids, and both groups have aspirations for their futures. The biggest difference I have seen is that in their hearts and minds, the kids from affluent families assume they will be successful. The black kids from less affluence do not make this assumption." That goes to show you how your environment influences your motivation and ambition subconsciously. When I later reflected on his observations, I knew that in far too many instances, this was true. These and other such debilitating beliefs and assumptions are also part of the legacy of trauma. The question remains, how are such effects of trauma transmitted through generations? The answer is quite straightforward. From how we learn to raise our children. We learn this almost entirely through our own childhood experience. Most of us raise our children based on how we ourselves were raised. Of course, there are things our parents did that we decide we'll do differently, but for the most part, parenting is a part of a myriad of skills passed down generation to generation. I'm going to stop right there. Now, that goes to show you how a parent can actually be brought up dysfunctional and misguided, and that child picks up that same dysfunction. Everybody doesn't deserve to be parents first off, but that goes to show you, just really how it's passed down from generation to generation. Bad behavior, good behavior, positive behavior, negative behavior, ambition. So now, where am I? I think I just started. What do you think the result would be if generation? Okay, let me go back. What do you think gets passed down through generations if what was experienced were lifetimes of abuse at the hands of slave masters and other authorities? What do you think the result would be if generation after generation of young men were not allowed the power and authority to parent their own children? That's deep. What do you think the result would be if education was prohibited for generations? What do you think the result would be if the primary skills that mothers teach their children are those associated with adapting to a lifetime of torture? Man, that's deep, man. I spoke on this earlier. Today, we know that if a child has an abusive parent, the likelihood that he or she will grow to be abusive is greater than for a child who comes from a safe and supportive home. We know that if a child grows up in a violent home, there's a greater likelihood that the child will exhibit violent behaviors as an adult. We know that if a child comes from a home in which one or both parents went to college, there's a greater likelihood that that child will go to college. We know that our children receive most of their attitudes, life skills, and approaches to life from their parents. We also know that most of these are learned by the time they are 5 or 6 years old. What training did children in bondage receive? James P. Comer writes, the slave family existed only to serve the master, and in order to survive physically, psychologically, and socially, the slave had to develop a system which made survival possible under degrading conditions. That means they adapted to a dysfunctional reality. The slave society prepared the young to accept exploitation and abuse, to ignore the absence of dignity and respect for themselves as blacks. The social, emotional, and psychological price of this adjustment is well known. In many families, the father is dominant. Who was the dominant male in a slave's life? The master was figuratively, if not literally, the father. It was the master who, more often than not, became the imprint of male parental behavior. And this imprint was passed down through the generations. As its foundation, this imprint was dominated by the necessity to control others through violence and aggression. While some of what we learn is passed on through direct instruction, the bulk of our learning takes place vicariously by watching others. That means leading by example. The individuals and families that survived the slave experience reared their children while simultaneously struggling with their own psychological injuries, and they often exhibited the typical symptoms associated with post-traumatic stress disorder. The children lived and learned the behaviors and attitudes of their often injured and struggling parents. Today, we are those children. The legacy of trauma is also passed down through extended family and community. During slavery, the black community was a suppressed and marginalized group. Today, the African American community is made up of individuals and families who collectively share differential anxiety and adaptive survival behaviors passed down from prior generations of African Americans, many of whom likely suffer from PTSD. The community serves to reinforce both the positive and negative behaviors through the process of socialization. For example, in the 1940s, families frequently suppressed any signs of aggression in their children, particularly their male children. It was an acceptable and expected practice in African American communities to severely beat unruly boys so they would never make the mistake of trying to stand their ground against a white person in authority. While the direct relationship between the slave experience of African Americans and the current major social problems facing them is difficult to substantiate empirically, we know from research conducted on other groups who experienced oppression and trauma that survivor syndrome is pervasive in the development of the second and third generations. Remember those words, survivor syndrome. The characteristics of survivor syndrome include stress, self-doubt, problems with aggression, and a number of psychological and interpersonal relationship problems with family members and others. Yale Daily, in International Handbook of Multi-Generational Legacies of Trauma, explains, the intergenerational perspective reveals that the impact of trauma, its contagion, and repeated patterns within the family. It may help explain certain behavior patterns, symptoms, roles, and values adopted by family members, family sources of vulnerability as well as resilience and strength, and job choices, following in the footsteps of a relative, a namesake, through the generations. Viewed from a family system's perspective, what happened in one generation will affect what happens in the older or younger generation, though the actual behavior may take a variety of forms. Within an intergenerational context, the trauma and its impact may be passed down as the family legacy even to children born after the trauma. This, then, is how the legacy of trauma has been transmitted. Given our history, should we be surprised that issues of abuse, ineffectual parenting, violence, and educational disillusionment, to name a few, continue to plague African American communities today. Many of these dysfunctional adaptations can be linked to the crimes visited upon our ancestors. These are some of the manifestations of post-traumatic slave syndrome. The next passage, post-traumatic slave syndrome defined. Post-traumatic slave syndrome is a condition that exists when a population has experienced multi-generational trauma resulting from centuries of slavery and continues to experience oppression and institutionalized racism today. Added to this condition is a belief, real or imagined, that the benefits of the society in which they live are not accessible to them. This, then, is post-traumatic slave syndrome. Multi-generational trauma, together with continued oppression and absence of opportunity to access the benefits available in a society led to post-traumatic slave syndrome. A syndrome is a pattern of behaviors that is brought about by specific circumstances. The circumstances that produce PTSS are outlined above: multi-generational trauma and continued oppression, plus a real or imagined lack of assets. What is the resulting pattern of behavior? There's not a single pattern of behavior. There are many. I have identified 3 categories: vacant esteem, ever-present anger, and racist socialization. I'm about to get rained on, and this next passage is over 5 pages long, so I don't think I'm gonna make it. From page 105 to 111, that's how long the next passage is. 6 pages, so I don't think I'm gonna beat that rain. Plus, I don't want to get my pages wet. So tomorrow, I will start on the power of belief. That's going to be the next passage. And with that last passage that I read, in so many words, they're saying that in the black community, most children lose hope because they don't have exposure or access. They don't have the guidance. They don't have the belief, or to believe that maybe being a mayor or being the next Bill Gates is within their hands. I could use Anderson High School in Donahoe as a prime example. Imagine the students at Donahoe when they go to school, the atmosphere that they're in, and the type of mindset that the friends have. Imagine that the household that their friends come from. And imagine when those children from Donahoe get out of school, the household that they go to. If they're not in their household getting some of the best representation or the best examples of, the realities of life, they're getting it from the friend's household. I know, because it was like that for me when my parents moved to Saks in 1978. Imagine that, 1978. My parents moved to Saks and I lived in the neighborhood where it was nothing but white people, and all these people had swimming pools, and it's just like the way they carried themselves was totally different. And leaving West Anniston out by Randolph Park and in Hobson City, moving to Hobson City and stuff like that, that was 2 totally different environments. And I was able to observe the hope and the dreams and the positive mindset, the topics that the people in Saks that I hung with and I played with, that they talked about. The motivation that they had, the ambition was totally different. Their fun was totally pure. It was a few negative things here and there. But then when I got to Hobson City, I got to West Anniston, it was like the ambition was a lot smaller. The values were a lot less. The morals decreased. The dreams that I could talk about with my white friends at Oxford High School, or that I could talk to with the neighbors I had in Saks about maybe being an astronaut, or maybe if I did like a country song, they could relate to that. I didn't have no problem with that. But when I got to the hood, when I got out there by Randolph Park, when I got out by Lincoln Park, or down south or wherever my friends and my family was at, I couldn't talk about those same things. If I talked about being an astronaut, man, somebody gonna tell me I was a joke. I remember somebody told me that I was a fool for playing saxophone, my chances of being famous or being successful from it was stupid. That was somebody from my neighborhood. These same people never came to see me play a saxophone. They never praised me. My own parents never, my father probably heard me one time, but I didn't get the support. My friends in school that I hung with, they didn't come support me. But it was always that other set of people that came and supported me and motivated me and let me know that, hey man, it is an opportunity out here to achieve some of these other things. So, it's a big disparity in your environment. So, you take that last chapter I read, and maybe you get the book yourself and read it, and you can actually see where she's coming from, how it's passed down through generations. The lack of access, the lack of exposure, the lack of positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. That's a big important value between how much of that you get. Negative reinforcement can lead to dream killing. Positive reinforcement leads to dream building. It leads to somebody saying, hey, I'm not scared to take a chance. Let me step out here and do something different. So we take that and run with it. Like I said, tomorrow I'll be on another topic, another passage on this truth. And I'm going to get up out of here. I thank y'all for getting this work. Share it. And I ain't doing this for attention. Once again, let me say it. I ain't doing it for likes. I've been keeping this in for a long time, and all the people with a platform and got so much, of a following, they've been saying the wrong shit my whole life. Now I feel like it's time for the right shit to be said because my community is losing. And it's losing in a major way. I don't do this for likes. I don't do this for me because I know this. I do this for my people because I love y'all. Love the hell out of y'all. You dig? It's Coco, baby. Coblow'S.